Hey, good morning, Gasaholics. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got Gas, the morning edition. And yes, it is me, for those of you who have missed the last episode where, well, it all disappeared. Welcome back to Gas. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you are here for a Monday morning. Now, one of the things I like to do is I like to do some research on some of the vehicles and the topics that I talk about. I mean, why talk off the top of my head when I don't know what's there? So I look at some of the different websites, and sometimes people that listen send me these websites and say, hey, like Marlon's doing, what is going on? Read this article. Tell me what you think. You're the guy that knows. What do you think? And sometimes I can think. Oh, I try anyway. Well, one of the websites that came up is called Hot Cars. I don't know where they're from. I don't know who checks their information, but I did look at one of their latest surveys or stories, and it talks about the worst Pontiac muscle cars to touch the tarmac. Really? Good morning, Richard Candahead in Texas. How are you doing? And Richard Turner as well. The worst Pontiac muscle cars? Well, first off, if they were bad, they really weren't a muscle car, but they may have resembled or appeared to be muscle cars with graphics or in, well, name and in their specific category or class. And that's something this website just didn't seem to look at. So Michael Weir, W-E-Y-E-R, wrote the article for Hot Cars. And he's got some nice photographs of some kind of cool Pontiacs for the most part. And he goes over them, but someone needed to check his facts because there's a lot of information that is not even close to correct. But let's start off with his first one. Number 10 on his hit list was the 1966 Pontiac Le Mans Sprint. Now, he calls that a failed muscle car. The Sprint, if you knew about it, was a very revolutionary car for Pontiac in that it had an overhead cam 6-cylinder. Now, no other U.S. manufacturer at the time was producing a regular production overhead cam anything, let alone a Super 6-cylinder. In base form, 165 horsepower. Now, if you're comparing that to Chevelle 6-cylinders, Ford Fairlane 6-cylinders, Mercury Comet 6-cylinders, this was a powerhouse. No one else had this kind of horsepower. The highest horsepower available was from the other companies, 120 horsepower. They were all overhead valve engines. They had no performance option. Was this a performance car? Yes. Was it a muscle car? No. It was never intended to be a muscle car. It was an entry-level performance car, not a muscle car. They were cool. It had all the equipment that a Pontiac Le Mans would have. Bucket seats, manual translation on the floor, 3-speed standard, 4-speed optional, Hurst shifter, that was the only way to go. It did have an automatic transmission option, and you had to because people bought automatic transmissions back then. But the Pontiac Sprint was a unique vehicle in the class. No one else had anything like it. I drove one. They were responsive, they were peppy, and they were much better on gas than a V8, a little bit less than their counterparts with overhead valve, but it was an interesting car. And it was a car that you could get into price-wise for less than the V8s. And when you look at the V8 at the time, the 326 was the only V8 available in the Le Mans. It only had 225 horsepower. So what was the 6-cylinder? With the 4-barrel, 205. With about 150 pounds less weight over the front wheels. It handled better. It drove better. Was it a muscle car? No. None of the Le Mans editions were muscle cars. They were sporty coupes. Sprint did the job. It was not a muscle car. So it can't be a worse car. But that is what this company is saying, both for the 66 and the 67. The other thing they're saying is, and I'll quote this, for its time, the V6 was seen as a letdown. It wasn't a V6. It was an inline 6. Fact checkers, Where are you guys? You're all over everything else. Get on this stuff, too. In 1973, the midsize cars jumped up to a larger body style. Pontiac came out with a very revolutionary, sharp-lined model, and they call it the Le Mans GTO. You've got to remember at that point in time, the Le Mans and the GTO, the Chevy Monte Carlo, or not the Monte Carlo, but the Malibu, the Buicks, and the Oldsmobiles all moved up into a larger body style. American Detroit thinking that people wanted bigger cars in this price range. Did they? Somewhat. Sales were reasonably good. The Pontiac wasn't a bad-looking car. It had big bumpers, like everyone else was required to have in 1973. It had pretty sharp lines. It wasn't a bad-looking car for the time. Was it a muscle car? In name, GTO. In power, for the time, yes. It had the horsepower available. It had the wheels that were kind of the honeycomb wheels. It had the striping. It had the bucket seats. It had the looks of a muscle car. And for the time, with all the emissions and horsepower reductions that went on because of the net rating versus the brake horsepower rating they had been using a number of years before, it was down on horsepower. Was it a powerful car? By the time, yes, it was. Was it a good-looking car? Wasn't bad. 250 horsepower? Still pretty good. It was more than you could get in most everything else. The rally wheels or the honeycomb wheels, the scoops on the hood, it had all the pieces you needed. And for the time, it was a muscular car. But you got to remember, there were no real muscle cars by that point in time because the horsepower ratings had been dropped and the emission standards were coming in, crash standards had come in, and they had to have the big front bumpers. So is this a letdown or a worst muscle car? No, it's a pretty good car. Now, number 8, the Pontiac Astra. Why would anyone even consider this to be a muscle car? It was a sport compact. It was Pontiac's version of the Vega. Yeah, I know, Vega. Well, it was okay. Now, I had a friend, we road raced. I had a Vega. He had the Astra. I could pretty much take him most times because his car was considerably heavier than the Vega because my Vega was earlier. It didn't have the door guard beams. That saved about 100 pounds. It didn't have the big, now required bumpers. That saved almost 100 pounds per end. We cut springs on ours to get them down lower because there weren't any real high-performance springs available initially on these cars. But, hey, it worked. The cars handled well, they drove well, and in their road course class, they were competitive cars. They handled quite well. Now, the Pontiac Astra had a little bit swoopier styling, I guess you could say. It had a typical Pontiac split grille. It had coved headlights. It had Pontiac-style GTO Firebird taillights. Was it a bad-looking car? No, not for the time. And again, this article is going back in time and saying these were not cars based on, or muscle cars, or proper cars based on today's ideas and standards. For the time, this was a nice car. Now, the one he shows as an example is strange because it's got 5-lug wheels. They didn't have 5-lug wheels. This was a V8 conversion. He shows another one, and it also has bigger wheels and strange scoops and things like that on it. And the crash standard bumpers have been painted. But he calls it upgraded to the Iron Duke. No. The later Sunbirds and Monzas got the Iron Duke. The Vega and the Astra got the aluminum Vega engine. To the best of my knowledge, tell me if I'm wrong, somebody. Sam Furiani normally gets on here. He can help us on that. Hi, Cheryl Lynn. How are you doing this morning? And Brett Mandela and Neil Panks. Good morning to you across the ocean. Now, another car he says was a muscle car failure was the 1986 Pontiac Grand Prix Aero Coupe. Aero Coupe as a failure. It was a limited production vehicle to attack the NASCAR super speedways. It had a sloping nose, kind of like the early or late 60s slope-nosed Mopars. It had a little bit of a spoiler in the back. It had a big greenhouse fastback style rear window. It helped on the super speedways. Now, the Chevrolet Monte Carlo had the same thing, the Aero roof, the Aero coupe. These were neat cars. No, they weren't powerhouses. They had 305 Chevy V8s. Not big, not gigantic horsepower. Were they acceptable for the time? Yes. Were they good handling, good driving, good riding cars? They were, especially these cars. They were great cars for the time. Now again, in 1986, what muscle cars were there? Ford was just getting into some horsepower in the Mustang, bringing it up to a little over 200 for a change. No one else had any horsepower like that. What was the 305 rated at? About 180 horsepower at the time. Again, net horsepower. It was a 2-barrel engine, and it was made to meet emissions and crash standards, and it did that quite well. The Grand Prix Aero Coupe, I'd love to have one of those, and the Monte Carlo as well. The fastback design with the big window, the little spoiler in the back, it's a neat little car. Now, they also say the Pontiac Grand Am 455. That was a torque monster. It had the same body styling as that 73 GTO we talked about a little bit earlier. The bumpers changed just a little bit. They got them a little more integrated, painted to match. It had the Pontiac pointed nose with a split grille. Was it a performance car? Again, for the time. Where was the market going? Not to performance cars like that. They were going more for economy cars. So the Pontiac Grand Am, it didn't necessarily meet the standards of a bad muscle car. It just wasn't a real popular car at the time. It was big. Had a fastback design. Kind of sleek styling for the time. 455 cubic inches. Whew. Man, that was good. Now they're saying it only had 170 horsepower. Nah, that's not even close to right. They were well over 250 horsepower on the 455s. They're also saying the 1982 Trans Am was a failure. And they are calling the Knight Rider version the problem. Pontiac never made the Knight Rider. That was a custom car made for television. It was never a production car. But why would they say the 82 Trans Am was a failure? 82 Trans Am was a pretty good car for the time. And it was a Camaro with, I think, better body styling and pop-up headlights. But they're saying it had a 5-liter V8 that could barely get 145 horsepower. Really? Yeah, it did have a 305 V8 as an option. The 350 was also available. And the Trans Am, as well as the Camaro variant, were pretty darn good in 1982. It was a far cry better than what they replaced. Now, was it a muscle car? No. It was a pony car. Camaro, Firebird, Mustang, Cudas, Challengers, they were pony cars. Now, they had some muscular options early on, but they were pony cars. Now, the Pontiac also had a turbo option, and the car they're showing, the Knight Rider they're showing, has the turbo hood. Now, that didn't go over real well. It wasn't promoted real well. But it was a stout machine with a small V8 engine and the turbocharger, making it one pretty good car. They're also saying the 93 Firebird was a flop. Why? The SLP version they're showing, or the Firehawk, was a performance car, and it was an after assembly line modified vehicle. SLP modified the Firehawks and the Camaros to make them even better. Better wheels, better suspensions, a little bit boost in other areas, and it was a cool car. But what they pick on is that it was a 3.4-liter V6. No, it wasn't. With 160 horsepower. Well, that part might be right, but the Firehawk that they're showing definitely was not a V6 car. That was a 350 V8. And if you're picking on the Firebird and calling it a failed muscle car because of the base model V6 engine, you're not doing your homework. You've missed the rest of the Firebird line. And the majority of the Firebirds were sold with V8s. 305 or 350, fuel injected, plenty of power, 6-speed manual transmissions available. Hey, I'd go for it. And I've got a few friends that have. And they were good cars. Not 160 horsepower, though. They're calling the Fiero a muscle car. A what? A Fiero? A muscle car? The base motor on the Fiero was a 90 horsepower Iron Duke 4-cylinder. It had a 2.8-liter V6 option, which was about 160 horsepower, and these were very performance-oriented vehicles. They handled well, and they had some horsepower for their size. Now, they're saying the weak 2.5-liter V6 engine. It didn't have a 2.5-liter V6. It had a 2.8 V6. And it was held back in further performance because they tried a turbocharged version back at the factory in test, and it was faster than a Corvette. The chassis design was revolutionary. The body was only there for looks. You could drive the car without the body panels. The body panels were plastic. They bolted on to a chassis that was completely drivable without a body. It was a very unique car. It was initially designed as a commuter vehicle, never designed to be a performance vehicle. And it did get the commuter around. It was a 2-seater. The 4-cylinder engine delivered over 30 miles per gallon on the highway. It was a neat car. It handled well. Now, initial models had the Chevette Isuzu front suspension, which was kind of, well, they downplayed it. They said it wasn't good. I've driven it, and I've driven the Isuzu and the Chevy Chevettes, and the suspension worked quite well. They handled quite well. Maybe not as well as they could, but by the final years of the Fiero, it was a stout handling car. With the V6 engine, 5-speed manual transmission, the GT suspension, it was a formidable sports car for the time, and it was unique, mid-engine. First General Motors production mid-engine car, and it was brought to you by Pontiac. Was it a muscle car? No, but it was never designed to be one either. So, Ryder, get your stuff straight. And you know what? It even had an Indianapolis 500 edition. Pace car. Neat looking car. Another one on my bucket list I'd like to have. GT 5 with a 5-speed. The later model suspension. Comfortable. Elegant looking. They're cool cars. Failure? Failure only in that it wasn't promoted the way it should have been, and it didn't hit the sales figures the sales department wanted, and Pontiac was being disassembled. They're also calling the 68 to 70 Tempest a muscle car failure. It wasn't the muscle car model. In those years, it was the GTO. In those years, the Tempest couldn't get the same engine that you could get in a GTO. The latter years of that 1970s Le Mans, you could get the 350 Pontiac engine, but you could never get the 400 or the 389 or the 455 as the GTO did. It was not a muscle car. It was the car below the muscle car. It was for the person that wanted the look of the GTO but couldn't afford the insurance or the price. You got the Le Mans. It had the same basic interior, bucket seats. You could get a 4-speed. You can get a floor shift, a console. You could have everything you wanted in the Le Mans except for the specific GTO options, such as the bigger engines, the Endura front bumper, the heavier duty suspension, although they did have a special Tempest option that gave you some of these things, including some performance. But you had to know which part number to order. But calling the Tempest Le Mans a failure? Nah, not even close. If you call that a failure, you'd have to call a base model Malibu a failure as well. And that just isn't so. Now, the other thing they do, as they put this message out there, they're touting how bad the Tempest was, and they show you a picture of a Monte Carlo. Okay, fact checkers, come out wherever you are. All right, now they do talk about the Le Mans 350 two-barrel engine with 265 horsepower. It's not bad. 265 horsepower is more than my Corvette has. I don't see them complaining about that. The 1974 GTO was now a trim option on what was called the Ventura, which was basically the Pontiac version of the Nova. Was this a muscle car? Well, if you looked at the accessories and the name GTO, you would say muscle car. It did have a V8, 350 Pontiac motor, and initially, they eventually changed over to the Chevy motors. Was it a true muscle car? Kind of. Was it a failure? No, not at all. You got to remember the numbers of cars sold by Pontiac versus Chevrolet or Ford were much lower. It had a smaller market. Was this a failure? Not by any means. It just wasn't the GTO of days gone by. Was it a good-looking car? I liked the changes they did to the Pontiac Ventura GTO version of the Nova. I liked the Pontiac front grille. I liked the Pontiac taillights. The rally wheels were a little bit different than the Chevrolets. They were more reminiscent of the Pontiac Firebird and GTO. Was it a good-looking car? Yeah. Even had a shaker hood option. I like it. So, what is the complaint about this not being a muscle car? Again, someone who wrote this was probably too young to realize why horsepower ratings were down in that era. Now, I'm not sure the age, or I don't know anything about the writer. He wrote a story. It got published. The fact checkers just weren't there. And maybe it's the whole group. So Michael Weyer, W-E-Y-E-R, I'm your fact checker here. You blew it, buddy. I'm Hot Rod Pop. You've got Gas, the morning edition. And we talked about a website that's talking about the worst Pontiacs. Really? They were cool. All right, this is Hot Rod Bob Beck. You're watching Gas or listening to us on Anchor FM, Apple iTunes, and a host of other stations. Thank you for tuning in. Today's broadcast brought to you by Service Tech in Simi Valley, California. You have a great day. And check us out on YouTube. If you missed the live presentation, you can see it in reruns on YouTube on demand, no cost. As a matter of fact, subscribe so you'll know when they're coming out. Subscribe to Two Tired Guys Productions, and you can see Talking About Cars and Gas all on the same YouTube channel. Two Tired Guys Productions produces Talking About Cars and Gas, the Great American Auto Scene. I'm Hot Rod Bob Beck. Please listen to us on iTunes. Right now, we're rated in the top 200 in Europe. Hope you listen to us. Take care now.